So now that we've talked about how gametes are formed and exactly how fertilization occurs, we're going to go ahead and go into the actual development of the human and how we start from one single-celled zygote to this huge multicellular organism. So there's a couple things we need to know before we actually go into embryonic development. We know that when the male and the female gamete came together in the fallopian tubes, that process was called fertilization. And when the nucleus of the male gamete and the nucleus of the female gamete came together, they created a zygote that had 46 chromosomes, literally 23 chromosomes from the mom and 23 chromosomes from the dad. Now, once this one zygote was formed, it does not stay just one cell. We aren't one big cell walking around. We know we're made up of trillions of cells. So what had to happen to that zygote is it had to go through a process called cleavage. And all cleavage is a fancy way of saying many rounds of mitosis. So that one zygote divides into two identical cells, which will then divide into 4 identical cells, and then 8, and then 16, and then 32, and so on, until we literally have a dense ball of around 64 cells. And this is what we're going to call a morula. This morula isn't going to stay a dense ball of 64 cells, and that whole time that zygote was going through these many rounds of cleavage, it was actually making its way down the fallopian tube, and inside of the fallopian tube there's actually lots and lots of cilia, and that cilia kind of rolls that developing or dividing zygote and then eventually morula down into the uterus. Now, once that morula gets down into the uterus and we have this dense ball of 64 cells, it is literally going to hollow out, and it'll have a fluid filled inside, and it'll have a layer of cells on the outside. And this is what we call blastula or blastocyst. And this is really important because once we have a blastocyst, this blastocyst is what is going to make its way to the uterine wall, and it will literally implant itself into the uterine wall. So now it will have a steady stream of nutrients, including glucose and oxygen, to continue the division process and the development process. As soon as that blastula attaches to the uterine wall, it will then go through a process called gastrulation. And all gastrulation means is we go from having one layer of cells to having 3 layers of cells, and these 3 layers of cells are what we call our 3 germ layers. And these are before this point, all those cells were undifferentiated. So now when gastrulation happens, these germ layers will begin to become differentiated and will develop into different components that will make up all of our different body systems. The fertilization process begins when the male gamete meets the female gamete and they fuse together to create a zygote. That zygote then goes through multiple rounds of cleavage, which is just a fancy word for mitosis, until it becomes a dense ball of about 64 cells. This is around day 4 or 5. And once it's about 64 cells, that dense ball will hollow out, and you'll notice that we actually do have a layer of cells on the outside and then a cluster of cells inside of this blastocyst over here. This cluster of cells is what is going to become the baby, and this hollow area is what's going to become the amniotic sac, and then this is the amniotic fluid, which we'll get to in a little bit. Then once we have that blastocyst is going to implant in the wall of the uterus of the female, where it will get a rich supply of oxygen and glucose so it can continue to get energy to go through the next process, which we call gastrulation. And when gastrulation occurs, that blastocyst, that little cluster of cells in our blastocyst, will actually divide into 3 germ layers. And once we have those 3 germ layers will become the endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm, and then those will differentiate into organs, and that's what we call organogenesis. And once organogenesis has occurred, we have what we call a fetus. Embryonic development will literally begin with fertilization, but after fertilization we went through all those changes, all that cleavage. That blastocyst has to implant itself into the uterine wall, and this is really important. You want to make sure you know that the blastocyst implants onto the uterine wall. There's another term you want to know, and it's called the endometrium. The endometrium is thin lining on the uterine wall that has lots of blood vessels running through it, and as the uterus was preparing for fertilization, that endometrium layer got very, very thick. if that fertilization does not occur, that endometrium layer is actually shed during menstruation. However, if fertilization does occur, that endometrium is going to be what the blastocyst makes its way into to attach to the uterine wall. Once the blastocyst attaches to the uterine wall, this is when differentiation occurs. This is when all these cells are going to begin to get their specific job. And this is when we get gastrulation. Gastrulation is the second major stage of early embryological development. And gastrulation is where we begin taking those cells that were in our blastocyst and we divide them into 3 major germ layers. And we'll get into these 3 germ layers in just a second. And they're represented in this picture over here by the different colors. And after we have gastrulation, we call this new ball of cells that's divided into 3 layers a gastrula. What we have to happen next is the formation of our spinal cord and our brain, and this is what we call neurulation. And this is literally the development of the nervous system. So we'll begin to see that occur as well. And that would be our 3rd stage of embryological development. So we talked about gastrulation. How does this exactly occur and what are these germ layers? Well, as soon as we have that blastocyst that's hollowed out and it implants itself into the uterus and now it has plenty of glucose and oxygen, differentiation of those cells occur, and that's when we get these germ layers. The outermost layer is going to become our ectoderm, and our ectoderm is what is going to become our skin, our nerves, any sensory organs, hair, nails. Those are all of those cells. So those cells that make up our ectoderm, which you can see down here in the light blue, are what are going to become later on skin, hair, nails, nerves, sensory organs. What we have represented next is our mesoderm, and the mesoderm is the middle layer of cells, and we can actually see that over here with this dark blue. And what we are going to get from our mesoderm is all those inner components, the muscles, the bones, any connective tissue. Those all become the middle layers. So that's what comes from our mesoderm germ layer. And then finally we have our endoderm. Endo means innermost, and this is the innermost layer of cells, and this is what's going to end up forming our digestive system and our respiratory system. All those hollowed out organs are going to be formed from the endoderm. Now, how exactly do we go from being a zygote to a ball of cells, a morula, blastocyst, and a gastrula, to an embryo, and then to a fetus? Well, there's some major changes that do have to occur. In order for an embryo to become considered a fetus, what we're going to have to see is differentiated cells into germ layers. And this is when we can actually distinguish the different layers. Cells are fully differentiated, and this all occurs during the first trimester. Now, you're going to hear me using the word trimester a lot, and what trimester refers to is a 3-month period. There are 3 trimesters in human pregnancy, and we're going to be looking at each one and the major events that occur in each one. The first trimester will go from day 1 till about week 12. And what we're going to see, before we dive into what we need to know, we need to go over some terminology. The first term you need to know is placenta, and the placenta is actually made up of 2 layers. It's what is going to be providing nourishment to the embryo. It's also what's going to protect the embryo from toxic molecules that might be in the mother's body. And it's also going to release hormones that are literally going to stop ovulation, which means it will prevent any other primary oocytes from being released from the ovary during that 9-month period. The next structure you want to know is the umbilical cord. And the umbilical cord is what connects the placentia to the growing embryo. And the umbilical cord contains some really important blood vessels, 2 arteries which are carrying blood to the placenta, and then 1 vein which is returning blood to the embryo. There's no mixing of blood between the mother and the embryo at this point, which is really important. However, substances can diffuse across the placenta from the mother to the embryo. The third term we need to know about is the amniotic sac. And the amniotic sac is going to be formed from the inner layer of the placenta. It's actually filled with a fluid that was inside of our blastocyst, and we call this the amniotic fluid. The amniotic sac is going to actually expand to enclose the embryo, and our fetus will actually be floating in this amniotic sac and amniotic fluid. The fetus, because the fetus will be moving inside of the uterus, it's going to be important for the fetus to have some cushioning, and that's what this amniotic sac is going to help do. It's going to help cushion the fetus from the mom's, against the mom's organs. It's going to help in muscle development, skeletal development. So make sure you know that the primary role of the amniotic sac, promoting fetal movement, cushioning the fetus during movement, and actually promoting muscular development. So now what are those major events that occur in the first trimester of pregnancy? Well, in the first week is when we had fertilization, and after fertilization we went through many rounds of cleavage to eventually go from a zygote to a morula to a blastocyst. And once we have a blastocyst, which is around day 6, that blastocyst implants into the uterus wall, and once it's attached to the uterine wall, it gets a steady flow of nutrients, and it can then go through gastrulation. Once gastrulation occurs, we develop our 3 germ layers. This is exactly when our placenta is going to form, our umbilical cord connection is created, and the amniotic sac filled with the amniotic fluid is also formed. During week 3, we have differentiation of our cells into specialized tissues. This is where they actually figure out what kind of tissues they're going to be, and then that's when we have our different germ layers. Week 4, we'll see organogenesis, which is where our organs begin to form. We'll also hear our first heartbeat. The eyes become developed, however, they are still closed. The eyelid is still down. Okay, during weeks 5, 6, 7, and 8, which is month 2, this is where the organs in the abdominal cavity are going to begin to develop. The limbs, the arms, and the legs get their final shape. And then finally, in the 3rd month, we're going to see the nervous system start to develop. That's going to be the neurulation that we talked about earlier, that spinal cord, and the brain will come from what we call the nodal cord. The limbs will begin to move a little bit more. We'll start to see some facial expressions, and at the end, we now, instead of having just an embryo, we can now call this structure a fetus. The second trimester is going to be from the end of month 3 up until about month 6. So there's some major events that occur during the second trimester. During the 4th month of the second trimester, we're going to actually begin to see the fingers and toes become defined. And remember, we talked about the role of apoptosis in embryo development. Apoptosis is programmed cell death. Well, apoptosis will occur at this stage, and so we get the little spaces between the fingers and the toes. The bones and the teeth, and of course we can't see the teeth, they are underneath the gum, but they're actually going to begin to form. We'll also begin to see the reproductive organs, and this is where we will actually determine if it's a boy or girl because we can see these in the sonogram. During month 5, the baby will develop some more fat. There'll be a lot more development of the muscular system. And this is where we'll begin to feel the baby kicking for the first time because it is developing those muscles in the legs and arms. By the end of month 6, we actually have a baby that's about 12 inches long, and it has a mass of just over 1 pound. Now we're going to be entering our 3rd trimester, and our 3rd trimester is going to be from the end of from about month 6 to month 9. And by the end of month 7, we're going to have body fat, which is going to help keep that baby warm. It's very important. It's going to have a mass of about 2 to 4 pounds, and it's actually going to have fully developed auditory system, and it's going to be able to respond to sound. So it can actually hear what's going on outside of the its uterine walls. At the end of month 8, our internal organs are fully developed, and the brain is actually going through rapid developments. Those neurons are firing lots of signals. The baby's able to hear things. It can actually open its eyes. It can see light coming in through the uterus. So this is a really important time of brain development for that developing fetus. By the end of month 9, the lungs are almost fully developed. Its reflexes are going to start to develop, so it will actually respond to touches outside, from the outside. And the fetus will actually start to turn into the birthing position, which means it'll end up being head down, so it's going to be prepared to be pushed out of the birth canal. At this point, the length of our fetus is going to be in a range of 18 to 21 inches, and it's actually going to be a fetal weight of around 6 to 7 pounds, depending on how healthy it is. When at the end of month 9, the baby will be ready to emerge. There's going to be many hormones that cause the uterus to start contracting, and it'll actually force the fetus down the cervix. The last contraction will push the baby out of the birth canal, and it will take its first breath of air. This chart is a good summary of some of the major events that occurred during each of the trimesters. You want to make sure you understand what's going on. There have been questions that actually ask you to explain what is developing during the second trimester. What are major events in the third trimester? Okay, and you can see here we also have some things. We have hair forming on the head during our third trimester, which is pretty significant. Remember, the eyes are developed, the ears are developed in the second trimester. The baby can hear sounds in the second trimester. The baby is very active and it's kicking in the second trimester.